After Stalin and the leadership of the first round of strongmen in Eastern Europe, periods of political repression seemed to ebb and flow. The amplitude of continuing waves of violence and death tended to be smaller in size and less in brutality. But the institutions of political repression remained in place, especially the party and the secret police, effectively controlling society to a significant measure, molding the psychology of individual lives. We shall return to the subject of trauma and loss during the post-Stalinist totalitarian state and during the post-communist period later in this chapter, as they provide the historical context for the lives of the therapist's current generation. Forms of trauma and loss. From the point of view of trauma studies, each trauma survivor population has a certain morphology, characterized by demographics, types of trauma, experiences, social supports, both at the time of trauma and afterward, and attitudes of the recovery environment to the trauma and loss. On the one hand, individual survivors are likely to have experienced a series of traumas since each wave contained different forms of trauma, and since a given survivor is likely to have endured more than one wave. The psychological legacy of Soviet trauma, East European therapists and their patients. How we worked together between 1990 and 1993. We had been introduced to our core group of therapists. They had corresponded with us about difficult patients and their own reactions to working with them. Some of these letters were clearly censored. They invited us to visit them in their countries and at their clinics. We saw them with their patients and colleagues and even joined them at the sites of disaster to work with survivors and caregivers. For more than 2 years, the idea of this book simmered in our minds, and by 1993 we were ready to set out on the task of writing it. We asked each therapist to select 1 or 2 cases that illustrated some aspect of trauma from the old regime, which was part of the clinical illness with which the patient presented. We did not restrict the use of the term Soviet-era trauma, as we wanted to learn from the East European therapists themselves the range of its usefulness for them, given their difficult experiences under Soviet rule. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Westerners watched those who had survived the era of Soviet trauma emerge into what we hoped would be the exhilarating light of freedom. What we have witnessed, however, is a slow and painful process of progression and regression, of hope and disillusionment, of unexpected psychological barriers, invisible walls that block the progress we had hoped for. In Beyond Invisible Walls, East European therapists themselves draw a compelling picture of the waves of trauma that their people endured, the institutions of trauma that remained well after Stalin's era, and their impact on survivors and their families. They describe the psychological remnants of those years, walls that confine people by unconsciously preserving old adaptations to political terror walls that divide one part of the mind from another, and walls that rise between one generation and the next. These therapist stories allow us a striking glimpse into how patient's trauma evokes the therapist's own wounds, how both speaker and empathic listener find their way to a healing process, how the two begin to dismantle these invisible walls. Soviet culture strained each element of the therapeutic frame and the working alliance in these treatments. A safe space, confidentiality, trust, neutrality. The very effort to create a therapeutic setting in a totalitarian society is filled with contradiction. How can the patient feel safe when the secret police could be listening, or at least exerting pressure on the therapist? Perhaps the therapist himself is a member of the KGB. There are philosophical contradictions between an individual's wish to integrate his life experience and the state's wish that he subsume his life to the goals of the state. Symptoms themselves could be seen as affronts to the state. Symptoms carried trauma-specific cultural as well as psychodynamic meaning. We're living in a strange, complex epoch, as Hamlet says. Our time is out of joint. Just think, we're reaching the moon, and yet it's increasingly hard for us to reach ourselves. We're able to split the atom, but unable to prevent the splitting of our personality. We built superb communications between the continents, and yet communication between man and man is increasingly difficult. Ideology of the Cold War. Freud as antithesis to Bolshevik thought. The therapists in this project were more aware than we how elements in Freudian thought had come to represent the antithesis of the Marxist view of psychology. Miller, 1998, describes how Soviet ideologues as late as the 1960s, fearing the intrusion of Western psychodynamic thinking in literature, the arts, and psychology, called forth a major attack on Freud. From the Marxian perspective, psychology must commandeer the psyche to the lofty struggle of historic class war. So, intellectually, Soviet psychology was at war with Freud. This logic ultimately led psychiatry to become an agent of the state, a perpetrator in its own right. For opposition to the state must represent some psychic abnormality of the mind, and thus became the rationale through which psychiatry via the KGB became the state's instrument to contain dissent in psychiatric hospitals. But for now, we wish to highlight the sympathetic chord which Freudian thought resonated with the dissident. Clinicians. Treatment under impossible conditions, conducting genuine psychotherapy under these circumstances, entailed considerable risks, and all the therapists assume or have indeed learned that they had extensive secret police files which charged them with such offenses as disseminating religious literature, teaching patients ideas against the state, and engaging in pro-democracy activities. How they managed to function in systems which, although they were changing, continued to attack their values, and spied on and harassed them, is a central feature of what these therapists have to teach. The mindset of the reformer clinicians. The language of the reformers, like the language of dialectic materialism and applied Marxism-Leninism, which they opposed, is filled with irony and contradiction. An illustration of the types of contradiction to which they were accustomed occurred when Russia, the new communist state, contradicted its philosophy by allying itself in 1941 with fascist Germany, the arch-enemy of the Russian people. In terms of dialectic materialism, the new pact was an illustration of the point that the practical is superior to the ideal. The therapists, as children, to demonstrate their mastery of this dialectic, wrote essays on topics such as why less is more, comparing the communist East with the capitalist West. Similarly, the dissident writers, reacting to the untruths in this dialectic, also chose a language filled with irony. The therapists living with contradiction in their use. These reform-minded therapists had been loyal communists. They wrote prize-winning essays on the glory of the New Age and the demands and sacrifices placed on the new communist man. They joined communist youth groups and, in one case, even founded a new one, more rigid and idealistic than the others. In time, all became disillusioned with the power structure that implemented those ideals, ultimately rejected the Communist Party, and all entered a field that offered some expression of empathy and altruism, although they understood that it was heavily infiltrated by secret police. Nearly all were asked to join the KGB for its equivalent and had somehow dealt with party officials who felt they had a right to confidential information supplied to the therapists by their patients. The patients. Search for connection. The patients described in this book presented with a wide variety of clinical problems which turned out to be trauma-related. Some were typical for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which we see in other settings, recurrent intrusive images, difficulty sleeping, alienation, psychic numbing, depression. Others are less common: phobia, obsession, eating disorder, work inhibition, suicidal behavior, and the attempt to erase an earlier diagnosis of paranoia. The patients and their relative endured a variety of political traumas: harassment, random searches by secret police, arrest, confinement, stigmatization, abuse by psychiatry, torture, thought reform, imprisonment, and labor camps. The psychopathology of all the patients was severe enough to interfere significantly with interpersonal relations and subjective distress, but only 2 were seen in an inpatient setting. The treatments usually lasted several months. Either the patients themselves or their missing relatives whose stories they are trying to reconstruct were charged with an array of misdeeds and suspicions, having belonged as students to pro-Western political parties, having a relative who emigrated to the West, being overheard engaging in political debate, or refusing to give a dog to a KGB official, or simply belonging to the wrong group at the wrong time, being a priest or a Jew or a bourgeois or an intellectual or a student. In the course of their treatment, they tried to reconstitute various broken threads of their lives. A father-daughter relationship, a father-son relationship, mourning for a best friend turned enemy, familial acceptance of an ostracized relative. They also tried to integrate dramatically fragmented pieces of themselves. These patients and their families experienced a malignant adaptive paranoia in which survival meant concealing one's feelings, opinions, ideas, and heritage, even from one's children. As a result, their children felt cut off from knowledge of their own past, from the emotional life of their parents, and from the causes and values their parents held dear. As permission was gradually granted to ask questions in Central and Eastern Europe, the results were revolutionary, internally as well as externally. During the treatments, the patients came to understand themselves better as they struggled to reconnect the broken threads of their lives. And similarly, therapists came to understand themselves and their society better as they struggled to integrate parallel experiences. In overcoming the inner walls which split off one part of the mind from another, and in breaking down the walls that separate communications between parents and children, the book offers viable models for individuals and groups within society to confront the past. These treatments provide a roadmap for communication applicable to families and groups as well as individuals, which addresses a legacy of silence, miscommunication, and suffering in these years of transition following the Soviet era. The therapies occurred in the years of perestroika and after in Russia and Central Eastern Europe. As the narrative thread in a given treatment unfolds, we note how, around moments of discord or empathy strain, traumas of the patient resonate with traumas of the therapist. We see shame at the pressure to yield to oppressive authority, guilt taken on when crimes belong to an older generation, disdain at the sacrifice of one's autonomy. We see yearnings for connections between children and their parents, and wishes to avoid grief, and mourning. Through this double exposure, we gain a remarkable experiential look into the culturally specific trauma of the Soviet era and the unconscious defensive adaptations to it, which have been part of its aftermath. Where unconscious aspects of patient and therapist overlap, we see trauma affecting culture and culture affecting trauma, phenomena which continue to spill over into the post-Soviet period. Despite enormous obstacles, these therapists chose creative ways to treat people within the old system. They also took on challenging roles within the reform movement. Powerful treatments did occur, as we reflect on these treatments using a psychoanalytic perspective. We see that feelings which the patient irrationally placed on the therapist, transference, and feelings which the therapist, in response, irrationally placed on the patient, countertransference, make dialogue characteristic of the inner world of the totalitarian state come alive in the therapist-patient interaction, reflective of dialogue between the informer and the betrayed, the captor and his victim, the purged parent and his orphaned child, the true self and the false self. The cultures. The therapists, as they listened to each other, found a remarkable constancy in the nature of the state-imposed trauma of their regimes. A trauma-specific Soviet-imposed culture. They also underlined the cultural uniqueness in the differing areas. The 6 countries represented in this book represent 6 different languages, 4 distinct alphabets, and 5 religions prior to communism. The histories of their respective countries involved rivalry, tension and war, occupation and partition of land at each other's hands. Romania currently occupies land populated by Hungarians. Armenia has experienced Russia as its savior and its vicious master. Germany had occupied 4 of the other countries in World War II. Reflecting on the years of even inadvertent complicity, the therapists do not excuse themselves from the implications of belonging to a professional group that broke the public's trust by joining in the state's oppression. They agree with Havel that we are all responsible. How could millions be governed in such a system, they ask, if we didn't all cooperate? Dr. Kuklicu explains the division between those of us who promote change and those who oppose it is an artificial one. Both exist within the self. They see that understanding the historical aggressor with empathy is as much a part of the task that lies ahead as is identifying groups victimized by the totalitarian state. It is from this broad yet at times painful position of responsible self-awareness that the therapists in this book witnesses the trauma in their patients and in themselves. Take their position. They carry with them wounds analogues to those of their patients, and a powerful humanistic tradition whose roots go deep in their culture and history. Traumatic conditions towards the end of the communist era differed. The Romanian experience was most brutal. The German Democratic Republic was the most regimented. In Hungary, a unique set of forces gave communism a softer face. For Croatia, Tito's communism had repressed ethnic rivalries. Armenians saw their plight in sweeping terms as slaves and martyrs to the forces of history. Russian trauma, brutal by any standards, is complicated in today's survivors by the problem of its own enormous losses and its aggressor role with the others in Eastern Europe. How we worked together between 1990 and 1993. We had been introduced to our core group of therapists. They had corresponded with us about difficult patients and their own reactions to working with them. Some of these letters were clearly censored. They invited us to visit them in their countries and at their clinics. We saw them with their patients and colleagues and even joined them at the sites of disaster to work with survivors and caregivers. For more than 2 years, the idea of this book simmered in our minds, and by 1993 we were ready to set out on the task of writing it. We asked each therapist to select 1 or 2 cases that illustrated some aspect of trauma from the old regime, which was part of the clinical illness with which the patient presented. We did not restrict the use of the term Soviet-era trauma, as we wanted to learn from the East European therapists themselves the range of its usefulness for them, given their difficult experiences under Soviet rule. It is not surprising that, as the reformer clinicians took stance against the communist Weltanschauung, that they also turned, at least temporarily, to Freud for a language to help them explain those internal phenomena which had arisen as their patients and they themselves had fallen prey to communist oppression. Thus Freudian thought officially reviled for so long as the antithesis of Marxist dialectic materialism became one of the philosophic languages of the successful revolt from communism. Working with these clinicians, collecting data, communicating those data to each other and reflecting upon their meanings has been a lively process in which new layers of meaning emerge, and inevitably the story winds up being told in a way that is different from its first version. Therapists are prone to countertransference reactions. Here, therapists found that, in the search of empathy with their patients, they unexpectedly ran into blocks or powerful affects in themselves which forced them to confront their own lost stories of family members who were purged or ostracized. In their interactions with their patients, therefore, these therapists often unexpectedly experienced intense emotions, such as especially warm feelings of identification or the opposite, feelings of rejection, isolation, fear, or anger. In each case, this intense reaction was a clue to ways in which the patient's wound, a legacy of the communist era, connected with the therapist's wound of the same traumatic history. As the therapist acknowledges and works through of his or her own story, the patients too are better able to acknowledge their past. Each individual chapter offers insights into the practice of mental health in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, the roles our profession played in complicity with the post-totalitarian state, and the roles our colleagues played in the revolutions which overthrew them. Most important, as each chapter elucidates survivors' internalized adaptations to trauma and loss, which cannot now be easily discarded. They became cautious and withdrew from confrontation. They unconsciously yielded to the power of the state. They sacrificed, while others exploited them. They projected guilt and responsibility onto the outside. They denied trauma, and they fabricated the truths of their own and their parents' lives. They became complicit with corruption. To the degree that these adaptations persist, they affect the ability of East Europeans to adapt to the changing circumstances of the present. The Iron Curtain dividing East from West was one such wall. Berlin just one segment. So too with the mind. In the post-traumatic condition, a state in which the stimulus barrier of the ego is overwhelmed, barriers form to protect the psyche from repetition of the overwhelming state of trauma. Later, these isolated segments of thoughts and feelings become alienated, split off from the rest of the mind. They no longer perceive or communicate effectively with either the outside world or the mind as a whole. Indeed, post-traumatically, each split-off section of the mind composes its own history. Each compartment, such as the victimized self or the warrior self, selects or represents memories, which add up to radically differing views of the past, present, and future. Maintaining these dissociations comes at a high personal cost. As energy is absorbed, protecting the splits in the ego or partitions in the mind, as though by an internal military, always fearing attack. Those citizens living within divided cities while under siege experience a sense of despair and numbing when they consider the past and the future. They therefore concentrate on a disembodied present as though it were an eternity. Walls of silence and misinformation between the generations serve to keep these disconnections in place. What of the psychological walls? Speechless partitions, which formed to protect individuals from the pain of trauma and loss. These walls, of course, are invisible, and often these remaining barriers lack words. Yet they still divide families, and they still divide minds. When the physical barrier is removed, we are tempted to conclude it must be gone. We see only an architect's reminder, but how are we to judge? The silent walls of trauma, when are they gone? When is there free commerce between all parts of the mind, and true resumption of connectedness between the generations? In truth, these invisible partitions change very slowly. Soviet political repression is the central focus of this book and primary source of trauma and loss for the patients and their therapists. But political repression became so folded in with war, genocide, famine, natural and man-made disasters, and disease that precise distinctions are difficult. Survivors find that they cannot isolate an atmosphere of political repression from these additional catastrophic traumas, which complicate them. Grasping the height and forms of these waves of trauma and loss is not easy, especially for readers in the United States and Canada. One problem is that the sheer size of each wave is enormous. Those who tell its history may speak from within. Only one psychological compartment within the still divided city of the mind. For example, there is the perspective of the young adult reformers and their dissident elders. Another is that of an older generation still loyal to now shattered Soviet ideals. A third is the view of children who in the past unquestioningly accepted that they have been taught. Also, we in the West find it difficult to relinquish our own biases formed on the other side of the divide. Historians of Russia divide the waves of trauma and death into 3 time periods. 1914 to 1922, World War I, Revolution, Civil War, Disease and Famine. 1926 to 1939, Political Repression, Collectivization, Industrialization, Famine and the Purchase of 1937 to 1938, 10 million deaths. 1939 to 1945, Second World War, 26 million deaths. To these we wish to add the post-war years, 1947 to 1953, in which Soviet political structure was exported to Eastern Europe. Later, we will describe the post-Stalinist totalitarian state in which the therapists themselves grew up, a state which, while less brutal, continued the same traumatizing institutions. The first wave, 1914-1922. The first wave of trauma and loss for peoples of Russia and Eastern Europe in the 20th century came in the form of the First World War and an estimated 1 million war dead. With its end came the collapse of overarching political structures, not only of the Russian but the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires as well. Civil war, epidemics of disease and famine followed, and the Russian Communist Revolution began. With it, political oppression played an important role in the loss of life of those who were perceived to stand in the way of the revolution's progress. Both therapists and patients in this book lost grandparents in this way. Losses on all sides were enormous. Between 1914 to 1921, Russia lost 23 million lives. The second wave, 1926 to 1939. The impact of the wave of violence, trauma and death between 1926 and 1939 is of special concern for this book, as it occurred in conjunction with Stalin's purges and his revolution from above, where he instigated vast social and economic programs, while drawing an ever-shifting boundary around who was within and who was outside the new state. Political repression and the police state institutions to carry them out became a primary cause of trauma and death. These purges charged people with crimes against the state, interrogated, harassed, and ostracized them, punished their families, tortured them to inform on others, confined them in labor camps, often under Arctic conditions, subjected them to long political imprisonment and often killed them. This wave of violence also set the precedent for a reign of terror in Eastern European countries, which would fall under communist rule later. The third wave, 1939 to 1945. War struck again between 1939 and 1945. And for much of that war, Russian land was the field of battle. This time, Russia's toll alone was in excess of 26 million premature deaths, some in combat, some related directly to the war, but many also products of a continuing campaign of state repression. The countries of Central, Southern and Eastern Europe were annexed by fascist Germany between 1939 and 1944. Indeed, the national armies of Croatia, Hungary and Romania entered the command structure of the Führer. Hungary, for example, sent 245,000 troops to fight with the Wehrmacht In Russia, some 50,000 were killed or froze to death. 70,000 were taken prisoner or disappeared. Hungary's 5 months' reign of terror by the Arrow Cross in 1944, a final destructive fascist effort, led to little but ruined cities and ruined lives. The post-war years, 1947 to 1953. Stalin's policy of political repression, while most cataclysmic during the purges of 1937 to 1938, was actually a continuous process before, during and after the Great Patriotic War. It reached a second height following it. This new wave of political repression occurred when strongmen applied Stalin's methods to the new socialist republics of Eastern Europe. The wave of political repression between 1948 to 1953 followed Russia's victory in the Great Patriotic War against the Axis countries. The USSR now occupied the countries on her western flank, who had invaded her. To protect against future German aggression and to expand her own sphere of influence, the USSR exported the communist revolution to the occupied countries of Eastern Europe. Militant communists like Matyas Rákosi in Hungary, Georgu Day in Romania, and Walter Ulbricht of East Germany took power. Most had been educated in Moscow during the war. Their regimes repeated in every detail the world order of Moscow and the paranoid political style of Joseph Stalin. In Hungary, for example, between 1949 and 1953, over 750,000 came under investigation for suspicion of political deviance. Of these, 150,000 ended up in prison or in concentration camps. About 2,000 were executed in trumped-up charges and thousands were maimed in brutal investigation. In the former Yugoslavia, between 1946 to 1948, Tito consolidated his partisans into the Communist Party. He eliminated former Nazi collaborators, harassed non-communists, conducted partial trials of political opponents, and executed his rival anti-fascist leader, Mihailovich. Returning anti-communist refugees from Austria were executed en masse. By 1947, there was radical agrarian reform, distribution of church property, and large estates. Kulaks were sent to prison by the thousands. In addition, when Tito broke from Stalin, more than 50,000 were mercilessly tortured and massacred in the same manner as medieval heretics. In East Germany, Ulbricht unleashed a reign of terror in 1952 with liquidation of private holdings, agricultural collectivization, and a strong secret police. That secret police organization ultimately imprisoned 200,000 of its citizens. Another measure of the severity of conditions was that 200,000 per year were leaving via after Stalin and the leadership of the first round of strongmen in Eastern Europe. Periods of political repression seemed to ebb and flow. The amplitude of continuing waves of violence and death tended to be smaller in size and less in brutality. But the institutions of political repression remained in place, especially the party and the secret police, effectively controlling society to a significant measure, molding the psychology of individual lives. We shall return to the subject of trauma and loss during the post-Stalinist totalitarian state and during the post-communist period later in this chapter, as they provide the historical context for the lives of the therapist's current generation. The list kept enlarging to include any whose criticism was seen as dangerous to the state. Intelligentsia, students, those with contact with the West, artists, and the professionals, those who opposed collectivization, and so-called prosperous farmers, kulaks. Even loyal members of the Communist Party became targets. The latter were dangerous because they commanded loyalty and therefore might inspire separate leadership initiatives. They were arrested and charged with political crimes. Therefore, however, the charges were more intricate. In the specious show trials, they were accused of deviations to the left or right, were tortured, producing copious confessions of wrongdoing, all so that the great social experiment could go on under a single leadership of the leader. The lesson was clear. No one was immune from the eyes of the state, and any could be caught in the web of political repression. Once arrested, victims were separated from their families, interrogated, tortured, forced to inform on others, sometimes brainwashed, sent to slave labor camps, often under Arctic conditions for what turned out to be indeterminate terms. Later, some were sent as shock troops against the advancing Germans. While loyalty often developed in the camps among the Czechs, there were at times powerful forces turning one political prisoner against another. Upon discharge from prison, they were still ostracized, often lost their families, were harassed and alone. Those political prisoners who were killed or who died in the camps were buried anonymously. They, as enemies of the state, were denied funerals and ritual. When their families learned of their deaths, often years later, traditional means of mourning were both officially and practically prohibited. Out of fear of further reprisals, widows destroyed photographs and letters. The result was that no vehicle existed for children to learn from their parents and families who these deceased relatives were. Circumstances of death or survival in the battle for Russia were often horrendous, accompanied with freezing conditions, starvation, and disease. Populations were both military and civilian, men, women, and children. Children who survived Stalingrad lived in the ground for 4 months and were swollen with hunger, afraid to speak, to even look people in the face. The specific trauma experiences included a full range of injuries, captivity, exposure to grotesque bodies and body parts, and the impact of killing as well as seeing others killed. In Russia, death in war, unlike being victimized by political repression, was a patriotic act to be revered by mourners and celebrated by the state. Ethnic cleansing and genocide. Jews, Armenians, Bosnians, for the therapist, patients and their families, we cannot appreciate the background of trauma and loss without considering the Holocaust, the genocidal killing of 6 million Jews in Europe, men, women and children, mostly from East Central Europe and Germany. All of the countries in which our therapists and their patients live participated in this slaughter. Hungary, for example, gave up 500,000 of its Jews to extermination in the genocide at the end of the war. Even on Belarusian and Ukrainian land, 1.3 million were killed. And such history is part of the life stories of patients and family members in this book. Mr. E was harassed and threatened for helping Jews. One therapist's father was interrogated and threatened with deportation for helping Jews. Another therapist lost relatives in the Holocaust and was denied access to the knowledge that her mother was a hidden Jew. Even today, the policies which placed this genocide into action are not acknowledged. Once again, losses affected the traumatic background of patients and therapists, and official denial rubs salt into the wound. 2 therapists lost family members in the Armenian genocide and remember their grandparents' accounts of the survivors' horrors. Famine, disaster and disease. The waves of death which swept through Russia and Eastern Europe also contained more than their share of natural and man-made disasters. The famines of 1921 and 1931–32 were unimaginable, with reports of cannibalism of neighbors and children occurring with some frequency, especially in the 1931–1932 famine. The latter famine was, in the minds of many, including our reformist therapists, a direct result of political decisions to collectivize farms at any cost, to relocate the more prosperous farmers, kulaks, and to starve farmers and their families while feeding those comrades engaged in the massive new industrialization. Here, the victims were rural and of all ages. Officially, the Soviet Union denied these deaths by famine. In the aftermath, the survivors, feeling unacknowledged and shamed, denied themselves even the memory of the tragedy. Public policy, at the very least, exacerbated trauma, and, at the worst, cut off emotional exploration of its psychological integration as a means of adaptation. Life by communicable disease accompanied the ruined cities of Russian Civil War period. The simultaneous presence of catastrophe, neglectful governmental policy, enormous numbers of deaths, and official denial became a pattern. We are able to see how political reactions to the Armenian earthquake of 1988 added to the trauma of those who suffered. The government failed to protect its citizens through adequate building codes and failed to mobilize effective rescue operations. Officials minimized loss of life and damage. They accused victims of excessive complaining, rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of their suffering and grief. Survivors of natural disasters such as the Armenian earthquake are bitter that the state failed to provide safety. To mobilize effective relief and to acknowledge loss and grief. In these ways, they feel the state contributed to their trauma. Reactions of civilians near Chernobyl also consider these disasters in political terms. An ecology of terror. We turn next to the general emotional climate in which Soviet political repression worked. One way of grasping the larger picture of how fear of political trauma and death affected so many people under communist totalitarianism is to think of the stories of the patients and therapists in this book as having occurred within a single ecological system of terror. Let us imagine living in a city undergoing purges in Russia or Eastern Europe. A secret police agent, such as Mr. R, arrives in his black car, terrorizes a household, pulling out a father in the middle of the night. This sets off a series of traumas that spread far beyond the agent himself and the man he seizes. The victim is interrogated, imprisoned, tortured. Upon release, in order to maintain his integrity and protect his family, he abandons his wife and daughter. But his effort at anonymity fails. He is again harassed by secret police, or perhaps placed in a psychiatric hospital against his will. The original victim, under threats to his family or under torture to himself, revealed the names of friends whose comments could be construed as politically dangerous, or he may even have been forced to torture other prisoners to demonstrate his commitment to the new order. Now the pain and suffering of new victims complicates his own. Moreover, during much of his imprisonment, the victim was probably kept in near lethal Arctic weather, where physiologically he functioned on a subsistent level. He probably watched many others die from illness and from beatings. While he made friends in prison camp, he also often felt distrust. Anyone could be an informant for the state. Cost of survival in the minds of our therapists. Those who survived such trauma did so at enormous personal cost. They passed on a legacy in which personal initiative and creative ideas were dangerous. Actions, behaviors, and even choice of words needed to be monitored. Contradiction, hypocrisy, and lies must be ignored, and feelings themselves were an ever-present source of danger, for they might lead to action that could be seen as an action against the state. Surviving spouses denied information or rites of mourning, in turn denied their children any remembrance of the lives of parents and grandparents caught in the purges. Survivors of political repression were still thought of as shameful and dangerous to their offspring, who were adapting to the new system. Alienation seemed inevitable, since acknowledging connection to such rats, pigs, vultures endangered the educational opportunities and, at times, the survival of their families. Because the charges were that the relative was an enemy of the state, it was necessary for the family to burn photographs, letters, and documents. There was no recognition of the victim's suffering or the family's pain. In fact, complaining would only lead to additional victimization. Both grief and mourning were arrested. Politically active parents withdrew their emotional attachments to children, as if that would protect them and their children from danger and loss. Instead, it produced an inner emptiness for all. A culture of informing, an even more pervasive stressor than political imprisonment, was the constant threat of being reported to the secret police and the pressure its officers could bring to bear on anyone to divulge information that would endanger someone else. Indeed, the entire network of human interaction described in this book was infused with the adaptive value of informing on others. Children had been taught that reporting free speech was a service to the state. Adults were bombarded with propaganda about omnipresent spies from the capitalist West, determined to destroy the great people's crusade. Advancement in one's career went hand in glove with informing on others, and then joining a party. If one was arrested, torture and threats to family would probably result in some form of informing, regardless of the victim's principles. Victim-persecutor split. Thus, central to the psychological legacy of the communist years is the fusing, in the same person, of the roles of being the one terrorized and of the informer, of being victimized and of persecuting others. In the patients presented in this book, we see highly principled individuals forced to turn against their fellows of becoming persecutors, and we see KGB members crushed by the system with which they had identified, thus becoming its victims. Such an atmosphere pervaded not only the world of public interchange, but most private homes as well. It affected people in every sphere of life, including, as we shall see later, psychiatry itself. Today, the children and grandchildren of that father, his wife, daughter, and friend, even the secret police officer, make up the general population. They too are caught up in the legacy of trauma. Their modes of adaptation have been molded by 2 or 3 generations of survival in the ecology of terror, and their defensive repertoire is different from those seen in the West. They suspect there is much they do not know about themselves, and much their parents sacrificed so that they might live. While most people contain the remnants of trauma and loss in silent ways, perhaps like a rent in the soul, a few, like the patients in this book, become identified as psychiatry ill. They threaten suicide. The therapists who listen learn that their patients' experiences are not so different from their own. Post-Stalinist totalitarian state. The legacy of Soviet trauma continued beyond Stalin's years. While there was generally less overt brutality, the swells and wakes of political repression were part of a more stable but paranoid environment. Khrushchev revealed Stalin's crimes and permitted Solzhenitsyn to publish A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But not long after, excessive revisionism became a crime. Dr. Konkov remembers his family reading Solzhenitsyn as serialized in the newspaper. But one day the publication stopped without explanation. He also remembers his father going to Czechoslovakia with the military to put down the revolution there. It was a topic which father and son never mentioned. During the years of the post-Stalinist totalitarian state, the form and structure of government, the one-party system, state ownership of economic activity, state control of the arts, the omnipresent secret police, were unchanged. Everyone worked for the state, was paid by the state, was housed through the state, and received his or her food from the state. In the post-Stalinist era, people became accustomed to complying with the dictates of the state, and developed coping styles that would permit them to function in a world in which they must deny their individuality. They knew how to adopt a false self, a caveman. They tried to become invisible for the eyes of the regime because, as Dr. Konkov says, the regime just does not like visible people, and they will fabricate a reason for prosecution. They tended to accept abuse of power, repression of culture, absence of free expression, falsifications, and hypocrisy as a way of life. In short, to live within a lie. The communists were the good guys. They learned quite early that regarding political matters, there was one expectation only, that the views presented in the media on that particular day were the right views, no matter what view was expressed yesterday or might be expressed tomorrow. Holding any other views risked public attention and danger, even if the therapists as children had wanted to learn about the history of political repression in their country. They would not have been taught anything on the subject. Teachers did not teach about the repressions, and students did not learn about them. The therapists reached maturity as Gorbachev came to power. They were now suddenly living in a world in which it was acceptable to speak more freely. The corruption and hypocrisy of earlier years were coming to light daily. Faith in communist ideology was eroded. Still, a discrepancy existed between what people said in public and how they felt. The therapists felt they must be most careful not to reveal private views in settings where informers could cause trouble in the later Gorbachev years. It became clearer that the system would not last, and a new layer of pain emerged: guilt over complicity in such an inhuman system. Psychiatry as victim and as perpetrator. The therapists were practicing in a field which showed the strain of being both a victim of Soviet attack and a perpetrator within its system. Soviet theoreticians took very seriously the ideology of the self in relation to the collective. Soviet man, an action-oriented worker, was non-reflective by nature. He was to be well indoctrinated in childhood, responsive to conditioning in accordance with the behavioral science of Pavlov, and amenable to the Weltanschauung of Soviet Marxism-Leninism. Dependency upon the state was a given, and compliance or reduction in individuality was a useful adaptation. Work, while idealized in theory, was to become an assignment from the state, to which the worker was to respond with adaptation and sacrifice. Genuine dissatisfaction with the state was not a complaint but a crime, or as the ideologues would argue, a mental illness. Their view of the new Soviet man is someone who would sacrifice all for the collective good of the new wave of history. Reflection, particularly self-reflection, which could lead to doubt or inhibition of action in the cause of the state, was seen as a reactionary and destructive psychological tendency. While the 60s began with Khrushchev permitting the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich Solzhenitsyn, it was quickly followed by a more reactionary frame of mind. Under Brezhnev, Soviet ideologues called out their forces to attack Freud's system of psychology, which centered on the value and meaning of the intra-psychic world. Stated differently, opposition to the state must then represent some psychic abnormality of the mind, and psychiatry in this less brutal state would become a more discreet instrument to confine political dissidents on the basis of mental illness. The impact of all these ideas violated the mental health field and its practitioners. As psychiatrists succumbed to these forces, they too joined the ranks of those who were traumatizing others in the name of the state. In Russia and, to some extent, in other Eastern European countries, the psychiatric field came to represent a perversion of its ideals. Psychiatrists condemned political dissidents to psychiatric internment, distorting diagnostic nomenclature in the state's interest. Psychiatrists informed on each other. Psychiatrists and psychologists affirmed the political notion of the absence of an inner life, influenced by early childhood experience and unconscious universal forces. Psychiatry, like other aspects of Soviet life, was both victim to Soviet trauma and a perpetrator within its system. World psychiatry, in turn, banished the USSR from international recognition in psychiatry for its practices. Later, when change came, it is no accident that Freud, the apostle of individual meaning and the forbidden enemy of the state, would become rehabilitated. After all, he was a theoretician whose ideas about conflict and compromise formation were steeped in Hegelian dialectic philosophy. Indeed, his language of internal psychic life would become one of the means of expressing the awakening in Eastern Europe and Russia. Revolution and stress in the post-Soviet period. Most of the therapists were active in the reform movement and revolutions of 1988 to 1991. Guiding their thoughts and actions were concepts articulated by such dissidents as Václav Havel, who insisted that what he termed the post-totalitarian state, characteristic of communist systems in the 1980s and after, was the responsibility of all who participated in it, thereby establishing a climate for ordinary citizens, especially the young, to challenge the status quo. They momentarily abandoned their skeptical inclinations, becoming more hopeful, and even temporarily euphoric as citizens. Groups led overthrows in each of the Eastern European states. For many, including the therapists in this book, the changes which came with the defeat of communism were a welcome opportunity for a new life. They felt more than ready to heed Havel's call, and were prepared to meet the new challenges. In the months and years that followed, they struggled to understand the forces that were working against them. The collapse of the communist state in Eastern Europe brought insurmountable problems of their own. Economic hardship, disillusionment, and violence. All the patients like Mr. R, identifying with the party, became depressed at the sudden loss in prestige. Others, like Hans' parents, denied overtly the extent of their loss and hurled themselves into new forms of work, but unconsciously passed on problems to their children. Some youths, like Karl, were afraid to enter a new world in which they would be accountable to be free. So now, in a state of clinical regression, they faced instead the threat of addiction and violence. Also, the post-Soviet era has been marked in the former Yugoslavia, and to a lesser extent in Armenia, by a resurgence of ultra-nationalism, ethnic hatred, and war. In these places, the collapse of communist states unleashed the powerful and destructive forces that had been repressively contained, exacerbating Victor's old PTSD and exposing Josip abusive violence, detention camps, and refugee status. Towards a taxonomy of Soviet trauma, a climate which permits and encourages studies of survivors of trauma during the Soviet era, particularly political repression, is beginning in Russia and its near neighbors. There, psychiatrists and survivors themselves are more likely to think in terms of trials of the soul, rather than psychopathology or post-traumatic stress disorder. Meanwhile, East Germany, Hungarian and Croatian mental health professionals have vigorously entered this era as a legitimate field of study. Armenian researchers have joined those from the West in studying survivors of the earthquake, and Ukrainian researchers have joined those from the West in studying survivors of Chernobyl. There are now group-level studies of political prisoners in the former East Germany. Examples include those arrested, imprisoned and harassed by the secret police. Some work on political dissidents held against their will in psychiatric hospitals. Treat Holocaust survivors and their families in Hungary. And work with soldiers and refugees in detention camps in Croatia. While the individual stories in this book, those of patients and their families, and those of therapists and their families, hardly constitute a representative sample, they do give a sense of the range of trauma experiences endemic in the post-Soviet world. We offer below a beginning typology of Soviet trauma and loss. We include categories of current-day trauma as well. The extensiveness of the list underlines how likely it will be that a given survivor will have experienced multiple traumas. Those who were victims or perpetrators in the culture of terror and informing. 1. Being informed on without their knowledge. 2. Secret police interrogation, torture and harassment, and being forced to inform on others. 3. Political imprisonment, long term. 4. Psychiatric gulag. Those who grieve for relatives who disappeared or were killed as a result of the above. 5. Arrested grief in their spouses. 6. Arrested grief and identity processing in their children. 7. Arrested grief and identity processing in their grandchildren. Those who suffered from the forced displacements of collectivization and industrialization. 8. Kulaks being forced out of agrarian settings. 9. Others being forcibly removed from their homes to accomplish the state's ends, those suffering in the post-Soviet era. 10. Identity crisis in youth. 11. Identity crisis in adulthood. 12. Depression in pensioners. Those who suffer in war. 13. Civilians caught in warfare. 14. Subjects of ethnic cleansing. 15. Refugees. 16. Soldiers with PTSD, other disaster populations. 17. Famine survivors. 18. Earthquake survivors. 19. Nuclear accident survivors, perpetrating roles. 20. Citizens performing their duty. 21. Camp guards. 22. Secret police operatives. 23. Psychiatrists who confined dissidents. Those of us who work with trauma and its recovery are aware that the nature of the recovery environment is important for its constructive processing. The world of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries was a world which denied the trauma its citizens had experienced. It doctored documents, withheld news, and condemned those who complained. It minimized statistics. On a more personal level, it blocked ritual, destroyed individual memory, and made the telling of stories about the deceased dangerous. One of the most profound effects of the period of perestroika and the revolution which followed was the beginning of a new era in which a more positive recovery environment has been forming, in which people are freer to engage arrested grief, if they choose. One of the purposes of this book is to model that re-engagement. The events which constitute the trauma and loss of the Soviet era are fixed and awesome in their scope. Also, the therapists in the course of their lives have understood the scope and meaning of the events in radically different ways. As loyal, patriotic communist children, they minimized and generalized the losses in the name of the collective state. As truth-seeking, reformer clinician adults, they dwell on what they know and do not know of their traumatic past, seeking in it clues of their and their country's identity, like those behind the divided walls of partitioned cities, and like the split fragments of the traumatized mind, differing parties view the same history differently. We encountered these divisions as we wrote this book. We have tried here to portray in this discussion primarily the perspectives of the therapists as we came to know them. Their mindset is one that is sharply ironic and from within the reform dissident culture. It is sometimes subtly and sometimes boldly at odds with common assumptions in the West. And it is a view which bristles at those who, from the outside, set about explaining to them what their history has or has not been. For example, the famine of 1931–32 began as Stalin was enforcing collectivization, deporting prosperous farmers, and forcibly seizing all produce from the farmers of the Ukraine for redistribution, threatening them with arrest for hoarding if they did not comply. When, shortly after, crops failed and widespread starvation and famine occurred in the Ukraine, the causes seemed to be both political and natural. Another illustration of overlapping categories is during the Nazi advance into Russia in the early 1940s. The state assigned political prisoners, or ZEKs, as shock troops, promising rehabilitation for bravery. but in fact the Czechs found themselves pinned between two foes intent on killing them: the advancing enemy and Zagra-Dotriad, a Soviet unit instructed to kill if they tried to pull back. Dr. Caesar presents a patient who illustrates communist society as one which is unable to tolerate dissent and to take responsibility. Mr. E is a man attempting to set right the abuses which he suffered at the hands of Hungarian psychiatrists, who, because of his dissident views, labeled him paranoid, hospitalized him against his will, and substantially altered his life by marginalizing him from society. These psychiatrists were functioning as they did throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, especially after 1970, as agents in a reporting culture, an indispensable link in the whole repressive apparatus, which punished dissident behavior by involuntary psychiatric internment. In the early 1970s, under Brezhnev's rule, many psychiatrists in Russia and other Eastern European countries joined the ranks of those who were perpetrators in the name of the state. Psychiatrists condemned political dissidents to psychiatric internment, distorting diagnostic nomenclature in the state's interests. Dr. Caesar puts her own psychiatric colleagues on trial, as it were, as she examines anew the culpability of those who condemned her patient because his views were a nuisance to communist society. It is ironic that Hungarian psychiatry, which may have moved beyond the other countries in this book, is the country able to examine in writing, in this case, the question of abuses by psychiatry during the totalitarian and post-totalitarian years. Such openness has been lacking elsewhere. Dr. Caesar identifies as a traumatized population those whom psychiatry has harmed through misdiagnosis. The story of Mr. E raises important questions about resilience in survivors of traumas. Throughout his narrative, we see in Mr. E a person with great hardiness, one who refuses the position of victim or patient. He does not dwell on intrusions or traumatic dreams. And while there is some numbing initially, he is involved with his neighbor, the treatment, and his doctor. Finally, Dr. Caesar's case points out that in the sweep of historical trauma, individuals exposed to political traumas of Eastern Europe were rarely exposed to a single trauma, but more typically to a series of traumas. Indeed, this serial nature of trauma is well illustrated and is a component in the longitudinal history of trauma survivors, which we need to study more. The soft dictatorship. We shall begin in the mid-1980s. At the time we felt fortunate to be living in Hungary, the jolliest barrack of the Eastern Bloc. In comparison to other countries in the region, ours was a soft dictatorship, a phenomenon which had started over 2 decades earlier. Gradually, during that period, the country saw open challenges to cherished assumptions regarding the central economic planning of a communist state. The government was experimenting with a limited private economy, a phenomenon completely unknown in other socialistic countries, and at the same time implicitly tolerating a previously forbidden ideology, namely the consumer society. There were already government efforts to provide a better quality of life for its citizenry, a bigger flat, a car, freedom to travel, and freedom to get goods or products. The Iron Curtain dividing us from the West no longer separated us so absolutely. There were special efforts to improve the public climate, with some easing of communication and an opening of borders between Austria and Hungary. Now, for the first time in decades, if you had money and a visa, international travel was possible. Consistent with these general policies, freedom in scientific life was also increasing. Dr. Katona and I were able to communicate with the international scientific community, and it became easier for us to travel to different conferences. For nearly 15 years now, we have been able to publish what we write. In general, those who do scientific research in our country have had easier access to the West than have those in other socialist countries, and with it, easier access to Western products and amenities that have made life and people feel a little better. In the past several years, the Hungarian government also began to tolerate publications by the opposition. Previously, these publications were secret, but now they began to be more freely circulated and more widely known in the country. These positive changes were, of course, in stark contrast to the severely repressive climate of the 1950s, which we shared with other Eastern European countries under Soviet domination. Complicity and dissent. But even under this soft dictatorship, our people, all of us, suffered in profound ways. We numbed our individual hopes and responsibilities. We cut off the continuity of our past. We sacrificed our own authenticity on the altar of collective irresponsibility. Faced with the reality of socialist life, we continue to adapt best by compromising both outwardly and inwardly. For even a soft dictatorship is not a pluralistic system. In fact, during Hungary's 1100-year history, we have had only 2 short periods of democracy. One was in 1919, following World War I. The other was from 1945 to 1948, after World War II. We do not have the cultural microstructure of a well-developed democratic country, which values autonomy, independence, dissent, and conflict resolution. Moreover, even a soft dictatorship tolerates no real dissent. It has one leader and one very powerful party, Socialist Party. The telephone rang. It was Dr. Eva Katona, my friend and colleague for more than 15 years. She explained, perhaps more enthusiastically than I listened, that she had a letter from our colleagues in America, inviting us to write about our experiences as psychotherapists in Hungary and asking that we travel to America for a working meeting to discuss the project. I was cautious. The invitation was to write about our experiences, our subjective experiences. Such reflection would be neither easy nor painless. A focus on countertransference seemed to call for self-exposure, but I thought some things are better left unsaid. Some pains need to remain private ones. Yet, I thought, if we psychotherapists cannot be open, who can? So many of our people, Hungarians, East Europeans, suffer from the legacy of the post-totalitarian world. So this is how we lived. Our teachers showed us and told us, and there was no other way to do things. Everyone lived the same way, and those who objected were labeled deviants. As psychiatrists, of course, we are called upon every day to see people who exhibit deviant behavior. We examine them, we listen carefully to their stories, we diagnose them, and we recommend disposition. People with suicidal, delinquent, drug addictive, and alcoholic behavior fall into this category. But historically, in the socialist totalitarian state, psychiatrists were also called on to establish diagnoses in individuals whose deviant ideas and behavior were thought to threaten the collective state. Sometimes our actions as psychiatrists contributed to this collective irresponsibility. Sometimes the carriers of these with deviant ideas came to an abrupt halt in the examining rooms of our very own psychiatric hospitals. Organized irresponsibility. A society which tends to punish independent dissent and conflict tends to produce two types of psychological adaptation. One is submission to autocratic power, abdication of responsibility, while the second is a kind of numbing or laissez-faire attitude towards political and social phenomena beyond one's control. Disavowal of responsibility. When responsibility is both abdicated and disavowed, the result is organized irresponsibility. As Howell tells us, 1986, words come to mean their opposite in a post-totalitarian society. In this way, organized irresponsibility is an ironic play on the traditional communist phrase, collective responsibility. But when collective responsibility simply doesn't exist, and when individual responsibility is forbidden, then the result can be only an organized irresponsibility.
Мы пойдем с конем по полю вдвоем. 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 Ночью в поле звезд благодать. В поле никого не видать, только мы с конем по полю идем, только мы с конем по полю идем, только мы с конем по полю идем, только мы с конем по полю идем. Сяду я верхом на коня, ты неси по полю меня, по бескрайнему полю моему, по бескрайнему полю моему. Дай-ка я разок посмотрю, где рождает поле зарю. Ай, брусничный цвет, алый да рассвет, али есть то место, али его нет. Ай, брусничный цвет, алый да рассвет, али есть то место, али его нет. Полюшка мое, родники, дальних деревень огоньки, золотая рожь, да кудрявый лен. Я влюблен в тебя, Россия, влюблен. Золотая рожь, да кудрявый лен. Я влюблен в тебя, Россия, влюблен. Будет добрым год хлеба род, было всяко-всяко.